I first started talking with people, and I would mention you can't challenge the court's jurisdiction. You can't. The jurisdiction, like, it's their courtroom. You can only challenge the jurisdiction of the person bringing you there and the laws being heard. That's what you challenge, not the jurisdiction of the court. The first thing I said to this lady, and I didn't know who she was, I'm sitting on the bench, I said, she asked me my name, saying I just gave the same response I did to the RCMP there. I said, until someone accuses me of a crime, I'm not giving you my name. And she started to kind of go off on something. I said, excuse me. I said, do you honor and respect the Canadian Bill of Rights and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Well, then she just come unglued. And she says, if you mention those documents one more time, you're going straight to jail. Well, isn't that unusual?
It is.
I thought those were supposed to be pretty fundamental supreme laws in Canada, and for just bringing them up, I was going to go straight to jail.
So what happened after that?
Well, I started laughing. I didn't care at that point. I was like, I'm going there anyways. I said, are you kidding me? So they had a recess, and then they brought me back in and asked me the same questions, and I gave the same response, and then bam, off to jail I went for 4 days. So that was one of the more interesting ones I had, where I got out after 4 days of that one, without getting into it too much. But here's the interesting thing. You notice that they talk a lot about freemen, the freeman movement and freemen, and using the freeman argument. And this is on the heels of what I was just talking about with this lady justice. She's not a judge. It was provincial court, which means it was a statutory court, which means my natural rights as a man have no standing there whatsoever. So she's almost correct when she says, don't bring that document up again. Because a lot of people fail to understand still. Is the jurisdiction and the venue. I keep trying to hammer this home with everybody. People are bringing incorrect arguments into the wrong venue. But this vitriol the government seems to have, like just the animosity towards free men and just these things that they're publishing, calling us all criminals. Isn't it interesting that if you read the preamble to the Canadian Bill of Rights, 1960, that was passed by the Diefenbaker government and given royal assent, it mentions free men right in the preamble. Now I'll just read that out loud, because if we're wrong, if being a free man and thinking that you have rights that don't come from the government is wrong and it's a crime, then all you have to do is read line number 2. Actually, it's the first line of the preamble. Right after it says an act for the recognition and protection of human rights. It doesn't say it's granting you anything, because government doesn't grant you anything. Government was created to recognize and protect your rights, not pass new laws. That's another fallacy. So anyways, get into the first line. The Parliament of Canada, affirming that the Canadian nation is founded upon the principles that acknowledge the supremacy of God, the dignity and worth of the human person, and the position of the family in a society of free men and free institutions. Well, I don't need to go any further.
There it is there, black and white.
It's right there, the first line of the preamble to the Canadian Bill of Rights, where they're supposed to protect and recognize our rights, talks about free men. So, now, and I talk about this in a lot of other interviews with people, if we use our logic and reasoning skills here, we can deduce that one of two things are happening. The government is violating their own Bill of Rights, or we're not recognized as something that has these protections. And that is the proper way to view these things. Do you think it's more likely that the Canadian government is just violating human rights and not recognizing their own Bill of Rights, or do you think maybe that they have maybe switched or altered our status in some way, or have allowed us to do it by our own ignorance, and view us as something that maybe doesn't have human rights and aren't free men? Maybe that maybe more like it's something as simple as they haven't properly clarified their status before going in there. They're assumed to be one thing, but it turns out there's something different, and they're not clarifying who they are when they first walk in there. And then they're hiring lawyers, or they're entering pleas, or they're doing any number of other things that sinks them right from the get-go. And then after they're already screwed, they're trying to use free man arguments that don't apply to you, because you've already admitted to being an entity or a legal person, something of diminished capacity that is not afforded those protections. And that could be summed up real easy with a point of law, and this is the Supreme Court of Canada, that if you are basically like an agent or a director or an officer of a corporation, you have no human rights. Because to afford human rights to a director or an officer of a corporation would be to afford human rights to the corporation itself. And corporations don't have human rights. So that's what we're going to lead into with some of the trust law stuff, is most people don't realize they're actually representing something else in the courtroom. They're not. People want to go into court and they want to say, I'm a man and I have human rights. Yes, we know you're a man, and we know if you have human rights, but that's not the matter before the court today. The Crown has accused you of being an officer of a corporation, and that corporation has no human rights and must abide by statutes. That's what's going on in the courtroom, but people don't realize that. They want to say, I'm a man. Well, of course you're a man. Everybody in that courtroom is a man or a woman, but they're there performing a role. They're there as actors. They're representing something, or they're acting as an agent of something else. And people have to learn what that all means. and why your human rights don't apply if you don't correct, say, a false accusation from the Crown, because then you're now acting in a limited jurisdiction, and you can't call on your human rights to protect you. Obviously, free men are spoken about in the Canadian Bill of Rights. I've been told not to mention this document again in a courtroom, or I'd be arrested just for mentioning it. So we already agreed that maybe something else is going on here. It's not that the government is willfully violating our rights or willfully just choosing to disregard this Canadian Bill of Rights and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which, again, I'd like to add, do not grant us our rights. We do not live under Napoleonic law. We do not live under civil code where we only have rights that are extended to us by the government and can be taken away by the government. These aren't privileges. The Canadian Bill of Rights actually goes on to state that Canada, the landmass where Canada is, nothing in the Bill of Rights is meant to abridge you, overrule, or create rights that basically remove previously existing rights. It actually acknowledges that there's previously existing rights, which means they're inherent. These aren't something that are just granted and then taken away by the government at will. That's where the whole free man concept comes from. It means that we have already existing rights that weren't given to us by the government, because rights aren't given to you by the government. That you have a right. A right it's yours. It's part of you. That's why they call it unalienable. A human right, a basic right, is just as much a part of you as your head or your arm. If you were to cut my arm off, you would alter me. You would harm me. That's the same as a right. A right cannot be removed. Otherwise, it lessens the whole. It now makes you something that you weren't before. You're now diminished. So that's where the free man concept comes in. It starts there. We go right back to the beginning to say, well, hang on here. I had these rights before the government came along, so how come I don't have these rights anymore? So that's where we started dissecting